Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to my channel. Today, Travis and I are going to be discussing how to change your negative thinking. I hope that everyone had a happy. Oh, let me turn off my other. Hope everyone had a happy New Year and happy holidays, and that everyone is doing well. All right, Travis. So, for those that haven't seen you before, can you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. As Bridget said, my name is Travis Goodman. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I live and reside and work out of California. Um, yeah, that's what I do.
And I'm on the East Coast, so that's kind of why we picked this time. He has to do it before work, before his children get up. So,
Yeah, it's 5
yeah,
a.m. my time, 5 a.m.
yeah.
Woohoo.
Woo.
So yeah, nice and early. It can be done if you want to plan on getting up early. It can be done. Um, so I'm living proof.
Yes. All right. So a lot of these principles are based on, and we're expanding on a video that we did previously, and
Hmm.
where we discussed cognitive distortions, and now we're going to be discussing basically how you can counter those negative distortions, because a lot of that can lead to a lot of depression, anxiety, stress, worry, etc.
Hmm.
All right, Travis, if you want to go ahead and start.
Sure. Yeah, and like Bridget said, if you haven't watched it, it's good because we go over the 10 most common ways. And this is based upon Dr. David Burns' work around depression and anxiety, which stemmed from Aaron Beck, who came up with like cognitive behavioral therapy. So a quick little history lesson, just in case you haven't watched that video. So you go over the top 10 most common ways we get stuck thinking, which is really important to know, because you need to know that in order to combat these negative thinking. If you don't know how your negative thinking is really negative or critical, then it's going to be hard to change. So the first thing is you really got to know what those are. So watch that video if you haven't. And once you do know those top 10 distortions, the top ways we get stuck in stinking thinking or negative thinking, the first way we can counter that is, well, we count what David Burns calls us counter the distortion. And really what we do is, and I'm a big proponent of this, is writing down your thoughts. So keeping a little journal or a logbook, write them down. And what I like about writing them down is a few things. One, it gives you a little space between the thought and you. So you're kind of putting it out there. You're actually physically giving it space too. There's a physical space that happens because you're now putting it on paper, which you're now able to see it with a little bit of actual distance, literally, physically. And when you do that, you can take your list of distorted thinking that you know from previous video. You can also just Google this, by the way, the top 10 ways we get stuck thinking. And you can start to go through your thoughts and start to label, oh, this is all or nothing thinking. Oh, this is catastrophizing. Oh, this is, emotional reasoning or mind reading. So it kind of gives you that space to kind of start circling or highlighting or checking or whatever to see, oh, that this thought is this. So that's how we start to counter it, by writing it down and by looking at the list of our negative thinking and kind of comparing it and saying, oh, there it is. There's that. There's that. There's that. And the more you do that, eventually you may not need to write it down all the time because you're going to be so aware. But initially, in the beginning, I encourage you to write down. So it just gives you that little extra gap and space and separation, so to speak, from the thought. Because often what happens is we get stuck in the thought. It's like part of us versus separate from us. So there's kind of a few things happening in that very first way that we counter it. Any comments on that one there, Bridget?
No, like you said, I think again, make sure it's important, if you watch the other video, to identify the cognitive distortion. That way, when you write it down, you know what you're doing. And like Travis said, it's just like anything in life. The first step is realizing what you're doing, because if you don't know what you're doing, then you can't fix it.
Right. Exactly. You got to be aware. You have to be aware. Then you can fix it. So number two is, which kind of follows along. So that first one is, it's really about the awareness of the thought. Here are my thoughts. And by the way, not every thought is going to be, not to be obvious, but not every thought is going to be distorted. Not every thought is going to be negative that you're going to have. But those are the ones that you want to change, are those, not the ones that are based upon, truth and facts. And which brings us to the next one, is examining the evidence. That's what's called, examine the evidence. So that's, what are the facts? So if you have this negative thought that, I'm a complete failure, or, I'm a complete failure. I'll never get this job. I'm always going to be rejected, by any future job. Well, examine the evidence. So first and foremost, are you a complete and total failure? What's the evidence that proves that to be true? So think of, like, in the court of law, think you are both the prosecution and the defense attorney. So you're giving it to the jury, which is also inside yourself, like you're also the jury. So you have to give a case showing the evidence, not just, what do they call, beyond reasonable doubt, right? So completely true. So the evidence showing that you're a total failure, the evidence that you've never had a job before and you've never been hired, that, right? More often than not, you're not going to have, you might have a small amount of evidence to show some cases that there might be some truth there. But more often than not, especially with this negative thinking, your evidence that's proving against it is going to be far greater. And so I like that one a lot. It's a fun one to play with.
And this method is really good, especially for the all or nothing thinking. For
Mm-hmm.
example, I'll always be alone. I'll never find anybody. Then you can
Right.
kind of tell yourself, okay, well, I've dated in the past. Actually have had people that are interested in me and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
interested in them. Or
Yeah.
like you said,
I've
I've
had a
had jobs
job.
before.
Yep. I've left
Or
jobs.
exactly. Or like even with school, I'm a failure. I failed this test. I'm going to fail out of school. Well, how many previous tests have you passed?
Right. Right. Have you ever passed?
Yeah.
You probably have. You can probably go back far enough to find it.
Mhm.
And it's good to see. And sometimes, and by the way, not to spoil it, sometimes you might see the truth and still, it might be hard for you to still accept the truth. And that's okay. That's part of change. Is change takes time. It takes repetition. So that's the examining the evidence. The third would be what he calls the double standard method. I have a different title for this. Some of these, again, this is David Burns. He's very much, he's got a lot of knowledge in this area. So I'm not
Mhm.
going against David Burns, but I think
Mhm.
some of the titles he uses, I just use them differently. So the title I would use, I call it the friend technique. The friend technique. Because what it is the idea of, when we tend to have negative thoughts, we tend to be very harsh, very critical, very
Mhm.
condemning. We almost like a bully. We have like an inner
Mhm.
bully, and really negative toward ourselves, and we hold ourselves to some unrealistic standard. And why I call it the friend technique is because often when we're talking to someone we love, or a friend, and let's say they're telling us like something to the effect of, I'm a failure, I'll never get hired, I'm a complete loser, I'm an idiot, we tend to be very patient, gracious with them, supportive. We tend to even help challenge those negative thoughts with our friends and loved ones, saying something to the effect of, hey, it's just a test. This doesn't define you. Or, hey, it's just one date. Or, hey, that was a job interview, or even multiple. And I get that it's hard. And we'll kind of have empathy for them. But we tend to counter that negative thinking and tell them the truth, saying, no, this doesn't mean that you're a failure. It doesn't mean that you're a loser. It doesn't mean you won't get hired. And
Mhm.
so I call it the friend technique, is because we need to talk to ourselves often how we talk to those that we love, and give ourselves the same grace, support, empathy, care, neutrality. Um, and so it's easy sometimes. Imagine you're talking to a friend when you kind of talk to yourself back again. So it kind of helps us shift that thinking. And I know some of you might be thinking, some of you is, and this is what I tend to get to when I first start working people with this, is we tend to have this rebuttal, but because we tend to say, but I'm unique, or I'm special, like almost I'm deserving of this way of being talked to. Um, you'd be surprised how often I hear that in my office. The people say, but I'm like, and then I kind of play with the crazy for a second. And I call it crazy because you're not actually crazy. It's more of a tongue-in-cheek thing. And I say, you're right. You are the one unique snowflake in this world that deserves to be spoken this way. And then I usually get often some type of smile or reaction, because their brain can't handle that type of sarcasm and the truth, because they know it's not true. And so there's sometimes this stickiness that we want to still buy into that negative thinking. And so sometimes I just go ahead and go with it and just call it out in my office. So if that's you, I would call you out and say, okay, you are that one unique snowflake that deserves to be talking to in a trashy way, which is of course not true. Everyone deserves to be spoken to kindly, every single person on this planet. So anyway, that's the friend technique. Any comments on that one, Bridget?
I really like that one. I think, especially like being type A or perfectionistic, having those kinds of tendencies, like you said, we tend to be hypercritical, and we would never talk to our friend like that. And we always offer grace, like, it's okay, you'll do better next time. Or, so definitely not beating down on yourself, because the world is hard enough for individuals. For you to just be beating down on yourself, you're only going to you want to be your friend, like you said, like the friend technique, but you want to be your own friend at the end of the day too.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. It's surprising. I feel like that this one in particular um, is one of the most simple as far as conceptually, like being kind to yourself. Like as far as a
Mm-hmm.
concept, like, oh, that's simple. Like, oh, I get kindness. We all get kindness, but often one of the most difficult to put into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like complicated. It's not like you have to balance on a toe while juggling 20 plates, and it's very straightforward, but often we get so stuck and so
Mm-hmm.
hard to implement. And so I often tell people in my office, I'm like, just start with kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be hard for you. Like it will be, but if you just did that, you'd be surprised how life changing that would be for you. And also initially how difficult it's going to be to implement that and to really catch yourself, to change that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one of my favorite ones.
Like, I think one for me, having ADHD, I'm extremely forgetful. And
Mm,
as a child growing up, like, I was never diagnosed with ADHD. So like I was
mm,
always forgetting things, homework, at home. And like my parents were really hard on me, like, Bridget, why can't you get
uh,
it together? So then when you grow up, I had to learn to change that internal dialogue of like, you know, I do my best. Like, let's say I forgot something, like, you did your best today. It's okay. This is part of your
mm,
condition. And just learning to not beat down on myself, because like sometimes I'll forget my phone at home, or
mm.
who knows? It's always something. I'm always losing my credit cards. Like, so like I'm working on it. Like, okay, how can we learn from this? Well, let's put systems in place, but also when it inevitably does happen, just again being kind to yourself instead of being like,
Yeah,
oh my gosh, I can't believe you did this again. Like,
yeah,
how do you not learn? Blah 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 blah.
yeah. Well, and you had a good point, and I thought we kind of talked about this, I think last time, but yeah, some of our internal critic is not just it's not just our voice. It could be our parents' voice that we kind of internalize. It could be a teacher's voice. It could be an ex's voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could be our own voice based on perception, based upon what we thought was true, based upon how we read the environment, and so, or a combination of all these voices internally. Um, so yeah, hearing from you is like parents. The perception was they didn't have a lot of grace for me, so I had to be so on and harsh on myself, and so I then took that with me as an adult. If I'm Bridget,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I have this kind of hyper criticism of myself, because this is what I received from mom and dad, and there wasn't a lot of grace there. And I would say this too, even if you didn't have ADHD, is it okay to forget things? Yes. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course it's okay.
Yeah.
Of course, you're going to forget things, and whether you have it or don't have it. Obviously, having it though, it gives a little more rationality okay, that makes sense why maybe it's a little more difficult for
Mm-hmm.
Bridget to remember, or that she's more forgetful, because there is something, uh, you know, um, happening within the brain that makes it more difficult. In fact, I just did a episode recently, a podcast episode on my podcast about ADHD. It's funny you mentioned that, and we talked about some of these things, of some of the common misconceptions, as well as what really ADHD is and how it affects us. Um, and how often we just miss it, but the impact it can have.
And
So,
it's so underdiagnosed in females because we don't
oh yeah,
present typically. And yeah, so I mean that's a whole other, we could get
yeah,
into a whole other
totally. It's a
conversation. But
yeah, yeah, totally. To
Nurse
keep it
Scott
focused.
says good morning. And Nurse Scott's actually also in California, so he's up very early. Good
Oh,
morning, Nurse
great.
Scott.
Good
He
morning.
says, I think a positive attitude is a habit you practice and develop. And yeah, Nurse Scott is always very just kind, and he exudes warmth and
Hmm.
compassion and positivity. So
Hmm. Thank
Cecilia
you.
says that I suffer from ADHD too.
Hmm.
So yeah, she knows the struggle.
No, it's real. It's real. It's definitely real. And good morning, Nurse Scott and Cecilia.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, it's real. It affects a lot of people. I think really misunderstood. I didn't even know a lot about it until I started, getting into my profession and having to understand
Mhm.
it, and working with people who really knew their stuff. Because I would get a lot of kids and teens in my office and adults that were just misdiagnosed, and it would present as depression or anxiety or a bunch of other things. And it's like, oh, actually, no, it's ADHD. It's just now
Mhm.
it's evolved into maybe some anxiety or depression because it
Mhm.
wasn't treated. So I
And
found that to be
exactly,
true.
like, it could lead to anxiety or depression if you don't know you have ADHD, and then you feel like, "Why am I different? Why am I so
Totally.
disorganized? Why is my
Mhm.
room messy?" And then you whereas if you have the diagnosis, you offer yourself grace. Okay, I'm going to
Mhm.
work on being more organized. But again, I'm listening to a book called ADHD in Women, and it talks about how people with ADHD
Mm.
lack executive functioning skills. So a
Mhm.
lot of the things that as that the gender of being a female or a woman is associated, it's really hard for women with ADHD. So it's hard for us to like be organized when women are known to be like the housemakers and very
Mhm.
organized. And it's hard for me to, I don't enjoy cooking, which is like a woman that doesn't enjoy cooking. Like, so, but when you understand maybe that this is due to my executive functioning issues, like this
Mhm.
is why I'm so different.
Right. No, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It is an executive functioning issue. In fact, not to plug my own video, but I have a short, it's like 5, 6 minutes, like super condensed of my podcast episode with Michael McLeod, who is a speech and language pathologist come ADHD coach for parents and kids and even adults. But it's on my channel, and I just released it actually on Friday, I think. It's like six
Hmm.
minutes. It's like nuts and bolts of actually what is ADHD, as well as some of the common misconceptions. And he's got a lot of research from Dr. Russell Barkley, and some others, that it really is all about. It's really it's not a disorder of attention. He says it's a disorder of performance, where we kind of know what we need to do, but there's a space between being able to perform what we know, um, and how the brain is wired. So it's really enlightening, especially for those who don't know what ADHD is, or even if
Hmm.
you do, you might realize, oh, that's totally me. And for me, how he put it and how he described it was so spot on. So it's a meaty 6 minutes. It's like all information. So
Hmm.
check it out if you haven't seen it. Um, and but you're right. I think some of the stuff you're talking about, Bridget, too, is some of just the traditional roles, that women are supposed to be this and
Hmm.
be this way, and how it can, ADHD is misdiagnosed, and how, even for men too, I think it's not helpful, because then it just becomes like, oh, it goes into some of the memes of men as well, like, oh, they're just forgetful, it's just the idiot dad, or it's like, well, that's
Hmm.
not helpful thinking either. Like, maybe they're
Hmm.
really suffering from something real that we
Hmm.
can treat. And yeah, all those memes, all those rigid roles are not helpful for
Hmm.
getting better for anybody, male or female. So, anyway, well, thank you for sharing. That was a little side note, but hopefully that was helpful.
Next one
Um,
is the experimental technique.
Thank you for keeping us on point. So this one is interesting, and I have used this a couple times with some clients, but it's all about doing a test to test the validity of the thought. So he gives the example in his book. Um, he says, like, if during a panic attack, not during a panic attack, don't do this, but sometimes we can think like, I'm going to have a heart attack, my heart's going to explode, which is not true. But we think this in the thralls of a panic attack, because panic attacks are very horrific, and to varying
And they
degrees.
really feel like they're going to die. Like they truly feel like they're having a heart attack.
Exactly. But your heart's and this is what happens. People go to the ER, which they should if it's first time sometimes because we don't know. So it's always good to get checked out. And people who are having true panic attacks, they do check the heart, and 99% of the time, unless there's some heart defect that they find, which I guess would be a good thing if they found out in the emergency department to say, oh, you actually have this. But more often than I would say, 99 times out of 100 is that your heart's 100% fine. No problems with pressure, nothing. It's just, it was the panic. It was the physiological reaction to the kind of psychological, neurological factors. So what he says was, if you want to do an experiment, he's like, well, if you really believe your heart's going to blow up, he's like, well, go do wind sprints up and down, and check your heart. So there's different ways you can do an experiment.
I wonder
like
if he
that.
has, do you know if he has any other example? Because knowing individuals that are in, like, especially working in acute care psych, I've seen people in the middle of a panic attack. There's no way they don't have the wherewithal at that moment to be like,
Yeah.
let me try this out.
Well,
Like,
you wouldn't do it in the middle of a panic attack. You would do
Mhm.
this when you're not in the panic attack. You would test
Okay.
it later. So this is one example. I guess another example would be going back to like a test, right? About if you think you're going to fail every test, right? I'm a failure. I'm an idiot. I'm stupid. Well, an experiment is, well, let's try another test. Let's, let me see if you're going to fail this one, and actually study and do everything you need to do. And so you can test the theory. Am I going to fail every test? Right? Okay, well, let's take this whole semester. Like if you're in nursing school or if you're in whatever, do an experiment with just that. Test the theory. Are you going to fail everything? Now, if you do test it, you have to do the work necessary to pass the test. You can't just do this test, half-heartedly and not study, not put effort in, and then expect to pass. I mean, I guess you could. Some people do, by the way. I knew some of those students in my classes is like they didn't really study and they just pass. I'm like, those people exist, by the way. That wasn't me. But you actually have to put the effort in to do the work and then see if you fail. So there's other ways you could do this test and like actually see if it's true. That's just one example. I can't think, anything off the top of your head if you could think of something, Bridget, but that's something else I thought of.
Experimental technique.
It's just putting it to the test.
Or
It's
your
like taking,
negative thoughts.
actually testing the thought.
I feel
Or
like it's
everyone thinks I'm
similar.
stupid. Everyone thinks I'm dumb. No one really, like that type of
So
thing
then
too.
asking like if
friends.
asking 5 people, do you think I'm
Yes.
dumb? And then that would be the experimental
Right.
technique.
Or do you think, whatever the negative thought is, and asking 5 people and writing it down? Because sometimes, we
Or
think
like,
if you're
there's
really
nothing good
minimal,
about me, and then asking people, what are some, can you
good
think
things
of
about
anything
me.
good about me?
Yeah. And because we tend to be typically in this experiment, we tend to be, it's usually often all or nothing thinking. It's very extreme. And so, you just need to get a few people to answer you with something positive and then work on accepting it. Because then what can happen is then we have this other thought of like, well, they're just being nice. They're just being,
Exactly.
like, no, just accept it, man. Just take it for what it is. So that's the experiment, is putting it to the test. That takes more work.
Mr. Midwife says, hey, Scott. So thank you for joining. Nurse Scott said panic attacks are absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
They are. So if you're in healthcare, please be kind to those that present to the ED with panic attacks and don't just dismiss them and say it's just a panic attack. You're fine. Like, please.
Oh yeah. Don't say just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw a really sad video about a poor guy having a panic attack. And I don't know if it was the nurse or the doctor that was just being so dismissive and minimizing. What's the next one? Thinking in shades of gray.
Yeah. So I like this one, gray thinking. So this is a good combat to all or nothing extremes. Is, when we tend to say I'm never gonna get the job, or I'm never gonna get, I'm never gonna go have a date, or whatever it is that we're doing is, okay, what's more gray thinking? Or everyone thinks I'm stupid, or how can I be so dumb? I'm such a failure. We'll think of at least 3 to 5 more neutral gray reasons as to why this happened. So let's say failed a test for some nursing exam or something. Okay, well, what are 3 more neutral reasons rather than I'm a complete and utter failure and I'm an idiot? Maybe it's, well, what's the context? Maybe it was, you know what, I haven't been sleeping really well, and I wasn't able to put a lot of time into studying, so I failed the test. That could be one of the many gray thoughts. Or maybe it's something to the effect of, I put minimal effort in, or maybe I put a lot of effort in, and I still struggle to pass the exam. But I'll work on learning from this experience and do better next time, right? So we're going more middle. We're not going to the extreme. So we're thinking of 3 to 5 other ways of thinking. Again, what I like with gray thinking too is try to bring in that friend technique. These go hand in hand. I think they really go well together, the friend technique with gray thinking, because often we'll give our friends, again, those more neutral thoughts when they get stuck in their kind of all or nothing thinking. So that's a great kind of pair, so to speak, together. Yeah, I like that one. Great thinking.
I had thought of an example, but I forgot it. No, I forgot it.
Well, it's anything in the middle, like I was doing with the exam, right? It's anything that's not extreme, that's beating you down with this hypercriticism.
Yes. Or, okay, let's say a lot of times, for example, you see someone and they walked right past you, or they didn't say hi to you.
Oh yeah.
Oh, he must not like me, or she must not like me. Whereas, so telling yourself a different inner monologue, like maybe they were busy, maybe they just didn't see me. Like there's been so many times I'll be at the gym and I'm just like tunnel vision, like focused, and people will say like, oh, you didn't say hi to me at the gym, or they'll be like, you're so stuck up. And I'm just like, I really was just like, I didn't see you, So explaining, like offering yourself another explanation for why things are the way they are. I gave the example before, like if someone cuts you off in traffic, like maybe they're just running late. Maybe they truly didn't see you. Maybe you were in their blind spot, and yeah, they should do a better job of looking, but they're not doing it on purpose to spite you.
Right. So yes, and I would say don't personalize it. Work on not personalizing everything, but think of some other reasons outside of just it's you. Now, sometimes it could be you. But I'd say more often than not, it's not. I think the social one's good, especially those of us that deal with some level of social anxiety, because often social anxiety comes with, going back to the list of negative thinking, is we tend to do mind reading. We tend to be very judgy about people must think these things about me. But more often than not, people are actually thinking of themselves. More often than not, they're probably worried about themselves too. And maybe that person, like you said, Bridget, is maybe they're in their own head. Maybe, they're not thinking about you at all, but you think they are just based on their look. Maybe they have RBF. Maybe,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I get that sometimes. I could look super serious, and people, we make these assumptions without testing it. So go gray.
Mr. Midwife says, I have a generally negative self-image. I don't accept positive comments, compliments very well. And Mr. Midwife again. So these individuals like Nurse Scott, Mr. Midwife, I know them from Nurse Liz's channel. So we go live sometimes together. And Mr. Midwife, just like Nurse Scott, you are amazing. You're a great provider. He's a midwife. He's a great father. What's some things that you could, for someone, not just Mr. Midwife, that has issues that has a negative self-image or has issues accepting positive comments, how can we work on that?
So I guess without knowing his story, so I'm going to generalize this because everyone's unique and we have different reasons as to why we get stuck in this way of thinking. My assumption would be this goes way back often to early childhood, typically, this type of like stuck thinking, more often than not. Again, I could be wrong, so I'm generalizing here. But definitely going back, if you want to just go off what we're talking about today, is the kindness, talking to a friend, even if it's hard. And knowing too, sometimes I'm going to go off topic a little bit, but sometimes this negative self-image and rejecting compliments is a way of survival as well. It often serves a purpose, the hypercriticism, often of saving us from something more painful. So it sounds counterintuitive, but often there's a part of us that we tend to be our own bully because it's preventing us from feeling some other pain. So it's like, if I know this pain, so it keeps us in this place. And often that probably started in childhood, adolescence. And so it's like, this was more painful over here, but if I could be a bully and reject comments, and because if I accept a positive comment, here's an idea. If I accept a positive comment, if I accept a positive image, but turns out to not be true, or turns out to actually be something else, that's more terrifying. So I'll stay here. And so that part of us, that hyper bully, tends to come out as a protector from something more painful. And I know I'm going a little deep here, but so part
So
of
it's
us,
like
we need
beating
to
ourselves down before the world can beat us down.
essentially, because I've already been hurt. And so, or I'm afraid of being hurt more. And so this comes out as a protector. And so one way I would say is get to know that part. Like, why are you there? Like, almost like befriend it and talk to it. It sounds a little interesting, but talk to that part, that critical, who rejects the comments, who doesn't take anything positive. Like, get to know that part of yourself, and say, why, what are you doing here? Like, how long have you been around? Like, what are you saving me from? Like, almost don't reject it yet. We don't want to reject it right away, but we want to almost like integrate it into ourselves and say, what are you really about? What are you serving? How long have you been? And almost think, when did that start for you? Like, when did it come around? Did it follow some event in your life, or events? Did it come out after something happened at home or at school or with a friend? Because that might be the key to understand why it developed. And often too, that way of survival might have been really useful when you were a child or adolescent. But now as an adult, it doesn't really serve its purpose like it did when you were a child or an adolescent. So those are some things I would start with. Again, I'm having to really generalize this here. So
he says, Mr. Midwife, thank you for sharing. He says, I was never good enough for my mother. You don't live up to your potential. You're a wimp. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's shame. That's all shame. Yeah, and it sounds very, very direct. So very, very strong negative messages.
Cecilia says that when she was younger, her mom used to tell her that she was ugly, and I should repeat 10 times looking at the mirror. And a lot of this is like challenge. Like, when we grow up, we think our parents are the ultimate authority, that they know everything, but realizing that they are human beings, and what they say is not an absolute truth, or any truth at all, right? That they have their own issues, and you can't take what they say for the gospel, right? So just because they told you something doesn't mean that it's true.
Right. And that might be coming from their own pain, trauma, and hurt. And yeah, so both of you guys, and I'm sorry to hear that, both of you had very, very explicit things told you, very explicit. So those explicits obviously are, I'm sure, loud in your head. And so you're going to hear those voices come up. I would still challenge you to go to talking to a friend. If your friend came to you and told you this, would you say that to someone you truly love? Or imagine talking to a young 5-year-old. Would you talk to a 5-year-old this way? You, not what your mom but you. Would you talk to a 5-year-old this way? And what do you think a 5-year-old will need to hear if they were hurting or made a mistake or had this? How would you want to give that? And often my guess is you're going to come up with something quite beautiful and quite loving. So this is the great time to bring the friend technique in, and to probably do some healing work on your own or with a therapist or something. There's definitely some stuff you can do with healing that.
And what I hear sometimes is like, well, I don't want to be like a narcissist or self-involved. Like, the love of narcissism isn't really love. Let's be like, I would say that, but like, self-love and compassion is just very different. It's not aggrandizing. It's not like I'm better than others, which is what narcissism is. It's let me, like, like loving a child, right? Like Travis said, like loving another child, or your child, or a pet if you don't have children. It's just very altruistic, kind, forgiving, compassionate, merciful. It's not that self-aggrandizing love, like, oh, I'm the best, and no, that's not what we're talking about here. So self-love is okay, and it is healthy for you.
Yeah, and there's some good books on. I mean, some of the stuff is attachment. Science of attachment related, about how we see ourselves and how we talk to ourselves. So there's a lot of good books. I mean, if you are some of us are self learners and self readers, and we like reading, and we can take some of the stuff we read and put it into practice. So there's some really good books out there about this topic, about shame and attachment stuff that if you're interested, like the Daring Greatly by Brene Brown is really good. Really accessible read, really simple to get through. Daring Greatly. It's all about shame and kind of this idea of not being enough. And she became known for about 10 years of research on shame in our culture and wrote the book Daring Greatly. She's written quite a few books too
I think
on
she has like two, right? Brene, like two
Brene
E's,
Brown. Yeah, one E.
one E.
Yeah, Brene Brown. But she's got quite a few books. One on leadership too, about being a good leader. But the one I'm talking about is called Daring Greatly. That's great. Really good book on shame. Another book that has a little more of a religious component is called The Soul of Shame. A little more religious, but I think it's well done. But if you have a little hesitancy around religion, I wouldn't read it. But it's a really good book on shame, and it's written from, he's a psychiatrist, Dr. Kurt Thompson with a C, Kurt with a C, C-U-R-T Thompson. He's a psychiatrist, so he writes from a psychiatric perspective with the brain and shame and how it could affect these things, but he also has a religious bent as well. So just as a warning there, if might be hesitancy for some people. Those are a few books out there on that that might help if you're a reader and want to do it on your own. There's some good books. How We Love is really good. It's written for couples, but it's a good book to see how it gives quick examples of childhood homes and how you were talked to and how we then internalize that as children and how that might come out in relationships. So you don't have to be in a couple. It's written for couples, but you could totally read it as an individual because you'll see how it plays out. That's a good book, How We Love, written by Milan and Kay Yurkovich. It's a name. Anyway, quick books on those topics.
Okay.
So were we survey method? We did that. Oh no, we didn't. Survey method. Asking friends. No, we talked about that. We did that, right? Survey method.
I lost my place, so I don't know where we are.
We did thinking of gray, and then survey method is asking. I guess it's similar to the experimental technique, so we didn't talk about it. So survey method essentially is you ask a couple questions, see if they're realistic. So he gives the example, like if you believe public speaking is abnormal and shameful, ask several friends if they've ever felt nervous before giving a talk. So if we tend to say, what's wrong with me? I can't speak in front of people. Something's wrong. Well, ask a couple of your buddies, and they're probably gonna say, yeah, talking in front of people is horrible. Mm-hmm. So the survey method is kind of testing it, asking friends, asking people that care for you, and see what they say, because they may totally align with what you're thinking and be like, yeah, you're totally fine. Like, it's okay to be nervous. Like, it happens. So that's a survey method. Next is define terms, which in this one, it's kind of taking, if we think like you're a loser, if I'm a fool, or if I'm an idiot, we put these labels on ourselves. My encouragement is, well, okay, go to Webster's and look up that term. Are you an idiot? Like, are you a fool? Like, actually read the definition. Because often we put these labels on ourselves, but we are not that. We don't act in such a way that align with the definition of a fool or of an idiot or of a loser. Like, it's funny when we call ourselves a loser. It's like, really, the definition. I looked up what loser is and dictionary on Google, and really all a loser is someone who loses at something, especially at a game or a contest. So sometimes we do lose. But a loser is just slang we use to demean ourselves. So no one's actually a loser in their entire life. You might lose at a game of chess or, a game on a sports field, but you're not an actual loser. So it's kind of like looking at definitions and using that as a method of kind of challenging it. For some people that works, some people it doesn't work. But that's defining terms. It's pretty straightforward.
I think an important thing is like not identifying with the situation. So for example, if you failed a test, instead of saying I'm a failure, you say I failed this test, right?
Yeah. You're not a failure, which is shame, by the way. Shame is guilt and shame, right? Shame is a negative prescription of self. That I'm a failure versus I failed, right? Or I'm what's another common one? Like, I'm I can't think of it right now. I'm having an early morning brain fart. But that's the big one. It's not that you're a failure. It's that you failed at the test. Like you said, it's a mistake. You could change that. You could change the behavior. We got to get away from that negative prescription of self. Like, I'm not enough. I'm an idiot. I'm unlovable. I'm broken. I'm, all those things we tend to say. It's like, no, we got to step away from that shame and say, no, this is, what can I do to change it? Like, I can study better next time. And some of these things, by the way, you'll notice some of these ways of challenging negative thinking, they tend to kind of go hand in hand. They tend to kind of flow into each other. Often, like our negative thinking, they tend to domino effect into each other. So you'll see how some of these they interlace quite nicely together to use in combination. That is in terms. So the semantic method is number 8. So this is kind of changing our thinking from extreme, or our self-talk from extreme, to changing the degree in less emotionally loaded terms, he says. So using less emotion. So instead of thinking like, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have, because we get stuck in the shoulds too when we tend to make a mistake, and which only beats ourselves up more. Like, I should have done this more, I should have done that. And that keeps us stuck and not moving forward. And so it's more of something like, it would be better if I hadn't made that mistake, or here's what I can do next time. Not that I shouldn't do this, I should do this. It's changing it to, okay, you're right, I made this mistake, or I didn't study, or I didn't do this. Here's what I can do better next time. Next time I'm going to make sure I plan ahead and really make some space with studying before this exam. I'm not going to study the night before. I might need to study 10 days before, versus saying, I should have done this, I should have studied more. It's like, no. Just, okay, I didn't. And here's what I'm going to do next time. So it's changing some of the emotion too, or instead of being super critical, like you're such that loser, well, take some of the emotion out of it, pull it back, and say something to the effect of, it's just a test. Look at the facts. Don't look at the emotion. Take emotion out. What do the facts say? Sometimes just looking at the facts can be helpful in this semantic method. Like, what are just the facts of the situation without personalizing? Like, what happened? I didn't pass the exam, or I got rejected on a date, or right, or the person chose not to go on a date with me, and then I got rejected. The person, because we'll say that I'm rejected, they rejected me, or it's like maybe they just chose something differently, or maybe you chose not to go with this person again. What's something?
Yeah.
Right.
And again, like, sometimes people don't like you for, maybe it's their own issues. Like, maybe they're super critical and you don't want to be with someone that
Right.
that quote unquote rejects you because, I've had guy friends that will tell me they don't want to go out with a girl again because she didn't have a pedicure. And I'm like, are you serious? Like, like something so superficial. So you don't want a guy like that anyway. So be happy that he doesn't want to go out with you again. And then, or, it could just be something like, it could go both ways. Like, for the guy, like, maybe she wants a certain height, and that's okay. Like, you're not gonna, like, you want a girl that's gonna love you for you, not because you're, 5'9", not 6, not 6 feet. So there's just so many reasons why people could quote unquote reject you. Like you said, they're not really rejecting you, and don't personalize it. Like, just keep dating until you find someone that accepts you for who you are, and embraces all of your quirks and everything. So
Well, and this could also happen too with like a job promotion, even like maybe you didn't get the job promotion. And this is, I think, this will also lead into the next one. Re-attribution is what he calls it, which is really looking at, instead of blaming yourself entirely for a situation, like that you're bad or you're an idiot or a loser, it's like, well, it's kind of taking a step back and saying, what are all the factors that contributed to this event, versus just you. Like, what's everything that led up to it? What are all the possibilities? So what are all the facts? So let's say there's 10 people going for a promotion. Okay, well, it's not that maybe that you're bad at all. Well, the reality is there's 10 of you, and they have to pick one person. So, and that can be hard, by the way, of course, especially if you want something. I'm not saying that, like, yeah, just deal with that. Yeah, it's kind of sucked that I didn't get it. Okay. But it may not be because you're bad or a loser or an idiot or not good enough. It might just be because, gosh, there's 10 of you and they had to pick one. And maybe all 10 of you looked amazing on paper. Okay, so they had to pick one. And so what's going to happen is, well, 9 of you aren't going to get it. It's not because you're bad, not because you're an idiot, not because you don't have the skill. It's because they had to pick one person. Or let's say with the date, maybe all these things that led up to it is like, well, what's everything that led up to this date? Do you even like this person? Right?
Exactly. Yes.
What are the other factors at play rather than just you being that label of some negative label? And so that's and part of reattribution too is focusing on how do you solve the problem instead of taking all your energy and just continue to blame yourself and the shoulds and what's wrong with you. It's like, okay, what can I do better next time? Or even like failing a test, like what led up to it in nursing school or maybe you're reapplying for saying what are everything that played into you not passing that exam, or maybe getting a B and you call it a failure. I mean, sometimes we say I failed and I hear people because they got a B.
Yeah, that was me.
Right. So that's a failure.
I
I got a
failed.
B.
If I got anything less than a 90, I failed.
No, and that's the thing. It's like, okay, well, did you actually fail?
It's like, no, but I did.
Right, but I did. So that's the thing we got to do too, is like, what's all the data to show? It's a lot of looking at the data and taking the emotion out of it, which can help us. It's what you're doing is you're engaging your left brain. What's the data? Getting out of the right brain a bit because we're overly in our right brain, the emotion side. So kind of helping the left brain come into this, like, hey, what's the data? What are the facts? And helping you kind of navigate that. So that's the reattribution, which is kind of similar to semantic methods. So again, some of these kind of fall into play. And the last one, which I do like, is he calls it the cost benefit analysis. So what I do like about how he describes it is you list all the cost benefit and the advantages and disadvantages, or think of it like in pros and cons but you do it of staying angry or staying upset first, or blaming yourself first. So what are the pros and cons, or the cost and benefit, or advantages and disadvantages of being angry or blaming yourself or calling yourself an idiot? So first do that, make that list. And I know it sounds silly, but do it.
Is there any advantage?
Well, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but do it. Or calling yourself not enough. So what's the advantage of that? And write all those advantages down, right? And then, or maybe do that for something like the negative thought, like I'll never amount to anything. I'll never get, I'm always going to be a screw up. I'm always going to fail. Okay, what are the positives of thinking of that? What are the advantages of thinking that way? And then what are the disadvantages of thinking that way? Or like a behavior problem, he calls it, like if you eat a lot when you're stressed out, well, what are the advantages of telling yourself that I'm always just going to overeat, I'm always going to do this. What are the advantages of doing that? What are the disadvantages? He gives another example too, is like the thought of like, I must always try to be perfect, or like in Bridget's case, I have to get 100 in everything. I'm sure that's not your case anymore, but at one point it was. I have to get 100 on my exams. So what are the advantages of and disadvantages of thinking that way? How is it actually helpful to think that way, or helpful not to think that way? So it's helping you kind of look at this, and more often than not, what's going to happen is you're going to have very little advantages to the critical stuff. You might have one or two, but
it's funny because when it's in regards to other people, we have so much more insight than when it comes to ourselves. Like when I was teaching, I would tell my students, because I could identify the ones that were like perfectionistic, I'd be like, don't put so much pressure on yourself. It's just a grade. Like you could still pass, you're still passing the class, and it has no correlation with how good of a nurse you're going to be. So we can offer grace to others, but then we're so hard on ourselves.
Well, that's when you bring the friend technique in to the cost benefit one. And in fact, I would bring that in. Bring a friend in. Imagine your friend told you this thought, and do a cost benefit analysis with your friend, which is you. But imagine your friend, and then give yourself, if it was a friend that said this, what would you say? And then write it down, and then try to accept it. So initially, for some of us, it might be hard. We might reject it. Again, that's often a survival thing, out of fear of being really hurt. So I think that that, like Mr. Midwife brought up, is that going back to what he said earlier, is that we'll reject it because it's more survival. We don't want to get hurt again, and so we kind of stay really in that criticalness because it's safer. It's safer. It really is. It feels that way, but the reality is
And it's also like what like you were saying before too. It's like it's almost like some people are afraid to be happy because it's not what they're used to. Like they're just so used, and that's why we keep repeating the same type of relationships, or
Totally.
even unhealthy relationships, because
Mhm.
that's what we know, and it's familiar.
Totally. Absolutely. So this
Mhm.
takes time. Oh, this stuff takes time. And there's layers to this, everybody. Like, it's just letting you know it takes practice.
Mhm.
Um, it takes identifying where you get stuck, where it comes from. And some of you in here know where it comes from. And so part of it's going to come from healing and grieving and different things like that. So it's a process, and just take it one day at a time and one thought at a time. And little by little, it can get better. Absolutely. 100%. We just got to start challenging this, and kind of really taking charge of our internal world, taking charge of our thoughts, and not just believing every thought that comes in our mind, or believing every belief that comes in, but really challenging it, like doing good, diligent work. Like a lot of you on here that are midwives and nurses and everything, you put a lot of work into studying and understanding information and challenging yourself, like you really
Mhm.
do. So take some of that stuff that got you here and apply it to your internal world. Take your talents, your skills, and apply it in time. Yeah.
He said sometimes we think if we accept a compliment, we'll come off as conceited. You can't accept a compliment with humility.
Hmm. You can,
I'm just gonna do a little, because I have dry humor. I'm just gonna do a joke. So we were on Nurse Liz's live, and Nurse Scott, I was gonna say, just like the time the plastic surgeon told Scott his face was perfect, because Nurse Scott said he went to a plastic surgeon to, like, see if he needed some touch-ups, and that the surgeon was like, no, like, your face is perfect. You don't need to do anything. So
yeah.
but no, I'm just kidding. So yes, it's we can accept a compliment. Carrie, I think was her. She had mentioned how it's hard for her to accept a compliment, and sometimes we'll deflect.
Hmm.
But just Nurse Scott also said, just learning to say thank you when someone
Yeah.
gives you a compliment.
Yeah. Just say thank you. Just say thank you. Yeah, it doesn't make you conceited. In fact, part of being humble too is knowing your gifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Balance that, so you're not narcissist for acknowledging you have a gift at something.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually knowing your gift sets. And that's a good thing to know what you're gifted at and what you're good at, and owning it. Um, and not, it's not being like, I'm the best of this. Like, no, it's like, no, just, you can accept and say, here's what I'm good. Here's what I know. I know that I'm good at these things, at these skill sets, or as a nurse or as a midwife, I have skill sets. I'm good here.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I
that's
think
not being
that's so
conceited.
important to know where you're good, so you know where you need not be.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
like we've had this conversation. Mr. Midwife is great with babies and labor and delivery. I love mental health and psych. That's not their area, so just knowing your strengths so that you can
Totally.
work
Hmm.
in your strengths.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yep.
All right, I think this is a good place to end. Thank you, everyone, so much for watching. Make sure that you check out Travis at his channel, Travis Goodman, and make sure you hit the like button, you subscribe, and you know the drill.